Anders, thank you very much for joining us today. Great to be able to speak with you about a topic that we've obviously been talking about for some time now, but I'm aware both from your personal, experience and interest is really close to your heart and something you were keen to share a few of your thoughts on. We'll obviously go into that in a lot more detail, but maybe just to get us started, I'll give you an opportunity to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Tom. It's a pleasure to have this talk. And as you as you introduced it, one of the key things for me, and then something that I've been working with for more than 20 years, is building new markets, whether it's with new regional areas or new countries, new cities, but how to sort of attack that from idea until launch has been a key part of my background. Um, I've built new markets for, as I mentioned, more than 20 years. It feels like a high number now. I originally started in the kitchen and appliance industry in the Nordics, where I built out chains, retail chains in Denmark, Northern, and Norway, and Sweden. Went over to the bicycle industry, was more on sort of dealer and distributor level, but also that back then it was on a global level. So it was really also looking at how to analyze new markets and find ways to enter those. Then I've done ran a few retail chains within F&B, both in the Nordics and also in the US. So all in all, it's been a lot of different industries, but always with a key focus on expanding into new markets.
And I know that if we take, your career as a whole, there was actually, a period of time and possibly the most recent time with Green Mobility that maybe brought some of that experience into real focus and a few really interesting examples you were keen to shed some more light on.
Absolutely, yeah. So from sort of that background, and for the past 7 years, I've been with Green Mobility, building that up and taking that into new markets. And sort of to give a bit of background, Green Mobility is an electric car sharing company, and and I think you even have to see it in the light of where we started it. We were definitely a first mover when we launched the company in 2016. Um, uh, that was at a time where EVs were all new. People were literally afraid of driving them. All sorts of things could happen to these EVs, and no one really believed that it had any business purpose and so on. We believe firmly that this would be the future of mobility. In general, very much focused on the sustainability part. How could we improve life in cities? Of course, on the emission part, but also in terms of sound, reduction of parking issues, and a lot of other things where we could really impact city life. Secondly, we also firmly believe that sort of in the future, requirements for fleet operators would be electric across cities in Europe. Um, uh, no doubt it's taking a bit longer, I think, than both we and many other in the mobility industry expected, but that is in fact what we're seeing now. So we really took a sort of firm belief that this would be the future, but definitely also a challenge in the start. And being a challenge of in our home market and building this company from scratch, naturally, then if you want to bring this to new markets, then you are faced with at least equal levels of challenge, and I would say even more so in some markets.
I think it's thinking then about those goals and lofty goals. If you go back to the early days of Green Mobility, I know that you look back on that period of time and actually consider the period of consideration and actually the thought process behind why expand. There's obvious assumptions to be made there, but actually the way in which you came to that approach was really considered, wasn't it?
It certainly was, because you could argue, why do you really why do you want to expand? I mean, build up a nice business in your home market, make it profitable, and live off of that. And I've certainly done that previously in other industries as well. And there's definitely there's definitely nothing wrong with that. Um, for us, it was really a matter about that we saw this industry changing. We saw that more and more politicians, cities, they really wanted to have this change. A lot of them didn't know how to, so it was really early on. But we believe that by being a first mover in this space, we would be able to capture maybe not all the market, of course, but a significant position in the market. So we chose it also from a, you could say, a land grabbing exercise, saying, okay, we want to be the first ones. But in taking that stance, that decision, you also have to realize and at least accept that it's going to come with a price. Because if you want to be a first mover, you will also be the ones to sort of pave the way for everyone else. And almost guaranteed you will have additional cost, because you're going to be the first one to take the investments in each market you enter.
And to what extent did you, looking at that comparison between domestic versus international markets, to what extent did you understand all of the reasons behind the success domestically? Were you learning simultaneously what was working at home versus abroad, or did you feel like you had a really clear plan that could then just be tweaked and adapted as you went into different regions?
Well, I think at that time, I think we understood most of our business. In hindsight, probably only half of it. There were some learnings that we came about as well, that we simply didn't know. In the beginning, we looked at doing our expansion on a franchise-based model. I remember meeting with a lot of potential partners around Europe, and sort of the returning question everyone has was, well, can you make this into a profitable business? Yeah, yeah, of course you can, blah, 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 and see the model about it. And at that time in the beginning, at least for us, we had a model. We couldn't really prove it yet. We could prove all the trends were the right ones and everything was tracking in the right direction, but there was no sort of ultimate proof. And I think had we had that, maybe we would have gotten more partners on board in the beginning of that. We had a lot of goodwill because EV in general was sort of a buzzing term. Everyone was curious. There was still a lot of doubt on how this market and this business model would develop, but definitely a question that I got a lot of places. So I think a key part, of course, is that you really know your own business, and I think most people say, well, we know our business. We've done this for X amount of time, possibly with the leaders and so on. But I think there's a good sort of exercise in it that you could even argue you could make a sort of old-fashioned SWOT on your own business, really figuring out what works in our home market, what doesn't, what are our challenges, what have we had of issues that we've solved, how did we solve them, and really have that of almost going back to the drawing board, and revisiting everything, and sort of say, okay, this is how we see our own business from sort of an outside perspective. So you are at least, I think, more conscious about what will be some of the questions, challenges, things to figure out if you want to go into a new market. Because the reality is then when you are just operating a business, and of course you're working very hard to make it succeed in every kind of way, you you um, you don't forget, but there's a lot of things that just become ordinary business. You don't think about them. Okay, we put up a new, in our case, we put up a new charging hub. So you've done it by then maybe 20, 50 times, so you don't think about it.
Yeah,
But
we're not stepping
going
back.
back to sort of the basis, okay, how did we actually start that? Because that's going to be a question for a new market. So I think that's a key part, really knowing your business, but also knowing, of course, the cost elements that you need to operate on. What are the cost limits we have today, but also where are the limits, how far will we take this? Are we willing to take this from a risk perspective?
And at the very basic level, then, once you've been through that process, how do you go about selecting where to expand? Obviously, if you take a look at Europe, there are obvious options in terms of comparable economies, languages, so many things to consider. So how do you go about that process?
For us, it was, I mean, I think the first question was rooted in our ambitions. We wanted to be a leader in Europe. Europe was sort of based on proximity, but also time zone, everything. We did have at one point a small venture in Southeast Asia, and super exciting. Let's go there. I would say, fortunately, it didn't materialize because if you're not a big company, then operating across multiple time zones it's a killer. I've tried it before, and I have no ambition of doing it again. Um, but but even within Europe, where we are sort of relatively close, you can fly to most places in Europe within, let's say, a couple of hours. Um, we are we feel like we are similar to each other in many ways. Reality is that there's so much difference in Europe. I did a count once where we have identified more than 160 cities in Europe that has 250,000 inhabitants or more.
Right.
For our business, we looked at very much at sort of city level. We wanted to expand to cities. So that was our sort of measurement. But and when you view it from that, that's a lot. And you could count even more cities if you want to take it a notch lower. And of course, then we are 35, 45 countries, a little depending on how you define Europe. Um, each with its own legal, governmental structure in how we approach various things. And our business also influenced GDPR in terms of we had a lot of personal data. We had vehicles, we had assets to finance, in insurance, road legislations, and a host of things. And in the beginning, you think, okay, how different can it be going to Sweden or Germany or Netherlands? And of course, you learn we are more different. We are more individually complex than just doing that. And I think it comes sort of from most of us have had a road trip with our family at one point and say, okay, yeah, of course we drive everywhere, but in Germany they have slightly different rules on some areas, and everyone has that, right? So I think that's really a key issue that find ways where you can navigate easily. Some of the things we looked at were, of course, distance, even though, as I said before, we are relatively close in Europe, there's still a huge difference between Northern Europe and Southern Europe, East and West. In distance, one, but also in culture and legal structures. So I think one basic choice could be, okay, we want to have it, if we want to expand, we want to be close to our head office, factory, or whatever it is in your industry. We want to take some decision on density in terms of the cities that we chose. Remembering before we identified more than 160s that we could potentially operate in, but let's find some that resembles the markets we're already in terms of density, but also from an income perspective, somewhere where we have a similar average income per household. And not to say that our business wouldn't work in other markets, but they're sort of working out of the premises that similar structures, similar income would be more inclined to work with our business. And then we can work on from there.
Okay. So from a set of criteria, you can get that 160 down to, okay, these are the 15 maybe that
Yes.
the most
So,
sense.
so we did those things, and we initially had a list of, I think it was approximately 35 cities. I remember we had a founder and chairman at that time who said, "Oh, we should have 50 cities." And I'm like, "Hey, let's just start with let's make the first 10, and then we can. There are lots of cities that we can work with, right?" But we had a list of sort of a defined list of roughly 35 cities around Europe. And then you really have to say, okay, so then these cities, they match on all the macro criteria. They are to some extent similar, but how do we choose then from how do we take the next step? How do we choose from one to another? So I think that's really where it becomes a key area, and how do you take these next steps?
Okay. And so you've reached that point, you've got your list, and you've got, I suppose, at least an initial sense of the viability. What are you doing then? How do you take that from a list to, to a viable and active group of new locations?
Absolutely. I think, well, initially, when you look at a list of cities, there will be cities where you say, "Wow, I want to do this city," just because I have a preference for that city, or someone else in the team has that preference.
Mm.
So unless you're sort of you build up a relatively strict structure right away, then the risk is that you will quickly sort of move into some the way it has some subjective sorting of that list. Um, so really, I think the key is, and this goes a little bit back to this SWOT of your basic business I was mentioning before, of define the most important elements of your business, and then analyze those for potentially the entire list of 35 cities, or if you're able to sort of break the list down in subgroups, because it's going to be a lot of work if you need to do it for 35 cities. But of course, that depends on your capacity and so on. But essentially, build a matrix and start scoring them, and then you start to have something to compare and make decisions on. We in the beginning we sort of just had a list, and then we wrote some data that we were able to find. But we also saw that in order to really measure it, one thing was to add a score for each element, and saying, okay, one thing is more important. Let's say in our case, parking was an important part. If we're not able to park our cars, then we can't make a business. Okay, so that has maybe a value of 5. Compared to some of the other elements, and some would maybe only have a value of 1, and then you can actually ultimately you can calculate a success number or success ratio of that city and compare it to other cities or other markets that you wanna go into. It's to some extent it's still simple, but it gives you something to work on, something to really consider, so you can make informed choices. At GreenMobility, we ended up defining a 14-step approach, or matrix, if you like. And it can seem a lot, but that was sort of the list of topics that we knew would impact our business. So for each city, we went through these 14 steps and analyzed them. And some of the things were parking, and of course parking availability, but also parking cost. And because if you operate a fleet of 200 or 400 cars, then if there's free parking, which some cities offer, then of course that's a huge benefit. Alternatively, if the cost in one city is double of the cost of another city, of course, then it's a major downturn in that case. So really looking at that. For us, operating electric cars, charging infrastructure was a key part. Today, I think I wouldn't put too much value on it. But in the beginning, we had lots of cities in Europe. Out of this list, we had where there was close to no charging infrastructure, or it wasn't publicly available, or it was hugely expensive or something else. So a huge barrier for our business. So that was a top point to analyze in each city. We looked at the political landscape. Was it a city that favored sort of green mobility, not our company, but the transition into electric mobility and so on, or opposite? How was public transport? One part for our business is that we learned that we operated quite well in cities where there was a good and well-working public transport, as opposed to no public transport.
Okay.
Because the better public transport, the less private cars people would use. And then that also had a positive impact on our car sharing business. Of course, we looked at competitors and a few other things to complete the list. But these were some of the key parts that really had a significant impact on our business, and those that we really needed to analyze in depth. At GreenMobility, we turned down several cities. And some were simply because our finding and our analysis was that, look, this city is not good for whatever reason, or we turned it down for strategical reasons. An example was that, being a Danish-based company, and we obviously worked a lot in sort of Northern Europe. We had operations in Norway, in Oslo. We had Helsinki, Finland, of course, Copenhagen, Denmark. We also wanted to have Stockholm in Sweden, sort of the last of Scandinavian countries. And we did the case for Stockholm several times. And each time we ended up saying no, because the cost levels of operating in Stockholm, despite everything else that was good, Stockholm was just off the charts. I personally met with politicians in Stockholm City, simply to argue. So, look, you are a country with a sort of sustainable focus. You have automobile industry, all these things, and they said, yes, that's fine, that's fine. But they didn't want to change for one, the parking fees in Stockholm were, I think, 3 times as much as Copenhagen. Copenhagen was expensive. And then, however we flipped the business case, it just didn't make sense. And we really wanted to sort of have that as a complete picture, but ultimately we never made Stockholm, because sort of the matrix that we had to adhere to it. We had to say, look, it's not going to fly, and you can sit and say, okay, then let's be a bit more patient, instead of having sort of a 3-year window until profitability. Let's move it to 4. We can do that for one city, and you can have all these discussions with your board, but you have to go back and say, look, these are the sort of the set of rules. These are the metrics we defined. It doesn't flow within that. We can't do it. So and sometimes it's tough. It's super annoying. But you have to do that once in a while.
Fantastic. And that sounds like you got to a point where, as you say, even with cities and locations that at a high level, you would think that, similar size, similar economic situations, you were able to avoid making assumptions, and you had a clear, data-based strategy for approaching that.
Absolutely, and it has to be data-based, despite how tough it may be. And as I mentioned before, there will always be subjective elements in it. Personally, I always wanted to do Hamburg as well. I really like the city of Hamburg. There was a lot of things going for Hamburg, but at the end we never made Hamburg because due to other reasons, and then it was voted down by our board. And of course, at one point I felt I was overly optimistic maybe about Hamburg because hey, that was nice. We had another in the early days. We had a potential partner in Mallorca, and half the team were fighting to be part of that project. Everyone wanted an excuse to go to Mallorca, and of course. We can all sort of appreciate that, and mind you, I wouldn't have minded going either, but the risk is sometimes then when you have that, you sort of ease off a bit on some of your requirements. So you really have to stay rigid to that. And even though how nice Mallorca or some other place would be, ultimately it's a business, and you need to see that it's capable of operating, of course, turning a profit as well.
And during that process, how you've hinted at it there with obviously enthusiasm for let's say a scouting trip to Mallorca. How much time are you spending physically on the ground in these locations, or is this something that you can do, just online and and through research?
Well, from my perspective, you have to spend as much time as possible. I think from a sort of a financial management perspective, you could argue, okay, this should all be readily available online. Make a call or a Teams meeting with someone if you need. You shouldn't. Why should we go and visit the city? And to me, that's then you're naive, and ultimately you're not committed to do that. If you imagine that you can launch or then maybe later on operate a market where you have essentially no knowledge of, that to me that's naive. Yes, you can Google a lot of things. You can look up so much things, uh, but there's also a lot of things that you can't. Um, and I've seen that firsthand myself. Things that we learn just by visiting people. So you need to sit down with people. You need to go and see a lot of people. One example is okay. You want to have for us, we wanted to have charging partners. Okay, so when we looked at Amsterdam, okay, who are the charging companies? We're going to meet with all the charging companies because I have no idea who's going to give me the best offer or best contract or whatever it is. So you need to meet all of them, and I think there are a few elements in it. One, of course, you will get more than you can just find on their websites, but there's also a matter of you building a local network. And if you're in a meeting, uh, they will tend to tell you a lot of other things that's going on in this example in Amsterdam that you simply were not aware of. Um, Maybe it's car-free Sundays. Okay, that's a huge part in this kind of business, or it could be something else.
And when you've done all that you can up to whatever point, and you feel that you've reached the threshold at which it's time to hit go, and to move forward, well, what's your approach to building out that team in a new city?
We always had our own local team. Of course, depending on the business, you may want to have it bigger or smaller, on however that depends very much on the type of business you're in. But for us, even though we had a lot of central operations, for example, our customer service was at a central point. We just had people who could speak in the languages where we operated. Because we were a platform basis, then people could call in from wherever they were, and we could answer them in their language. But of course, and on sort of the local side, of course, we had a fleet to service. We had a high number of cars. They needed some some local servicing. Ultimately, I think we could have bought that from a service company in each city we were in. But to me, it was also important that we had a local manager who, for one, knew the city, were able to advise head office, but also be sort of on the ground every day. Okay, now there's a festival in this part of the city. We have to factor that into our business. I would never have, or anyone in the head office would never have sort of picked up on that. You need to have a local. In our type of vision, we need to have a local team who had that information and were able to adjust the business from an operational standpoint. Or look, there's an opportunity here, there's a newspaper article here where we can contribute or something else. I think that's really a key part in order to really build the business and move it forward. Of course, it also comes with some challenges. Going back to what I said before, that yes, Europe is close. We are close to each other, but we have lots of different rules, and especially on employment laws in terms of hiring, termination as well. It's not just business as usual, at least not in all countries. So really, I think that's a key part you need to source any knowledge about before you do it. We had some learnings over the years, some of them based on just we assume things, and of course you can never assume. That's really the wrong things. And of course some of this is available, and you can look it up. But that's a key point really to understand employment law. And then I think regardless of however you want to build your organization, you need to be present. This idea that I've met sometimes that you can launch a market and you can hire a local manager and then everything is just perfect and just run, and you call him once a week and say, okay, how did we do last week? So just have that one-on-one or whatever it is. To me, that's not working, because regardless of where your head office is, could be Danish, a UK, German based, that's where your culture sits. And if you're not super focused on bringing that culture to each market, and sort of doing some kind of cross-contamination, really saying, okay, if we don't bring this culture into the new market, then they're not going to do what you expect. They're going to do their best, I'm sure, and they're going to work hard, but it's going to go in different directions because we have different cultures. So the Dutch people will do something different than the Danish or the Germans. So really finding a way of having them close. What we did usually with sort of new, especially with sort of city managers, country managers, we brought them to our head office. But you can also consider sending some of your seasoned staff. Look, this is a new market, go there 3 to 6 months, help them build it up and sort of bring our culture that way. So really get that cross-contamination, for better words, going and to help the organization, because it's going to be much smoother. There will be differences. So of course you will have email, Teams meeting, all that, but it's never going to be the same. We are in leadership and in business, we are people, and we need to engage with each other on a personal level as well, especially when it comes to company culture.
Yeah. And I suppose that also then drives, on one hand, you have the local expertise, but you also get the culture and company expertise in that first 6 months by having that presence on the ground, as it were.
Absolutely. That you even though, I mean, I've also hired local people who has had some kind of industry experience, but that may not be the same way either. So you bring in the experience, help them to get sort of off the ground much faster. because they know the local parts that I don't know. They speak, let's say, the language. They used to moving around in the city. They have a lot of local contacts, which I don't. But we can bring in all the key part of our company and the industry.
And so after that initial period then, and I don't know how long this would have been for you at GreenMobility, whether it was, 3, 6, 12 months, but how and when are you assessing and measuring success? What does that look like?
I mean, in a sales organization, I would measure sort of sales or revenue from day one. But realistically, I think you need to get at least a few months into it. But of course, I think in any business, if you have let's say a launch date or something, everyone's gonna be eager to see the revenue day one, day two, the first week, and so on. But in terms of tracking it versus the business case, I think you need a few months realistically, because there will always be some elements that then you need to account for, you need to align or adjust for that something were not completed right. And I would say at least half of it you will learn within the first month. And what we saw, it was typically some errors in parking rules. Okay, when you're in the first couple of weeks, you get a lot of parking fines. Then, okay, we've done some information wrong in our system, so people are parking where they're not allowed to park. Okay, that's usually an easy fix, and then you move on. But tracking it, I think the first 3 to 6 months is really close, and understanding what happens day by day. Are we picking up new customers? Are we driving more and more? Do we have more trips in our perspective? Are the metrics of the business, are they growing as they should? Are all the metrics growing, or is only one or two metric growing? So really starting the same KPI analysis that we do in all other markets. If the rate of growth is not the same that you would expect, okay, then start looking at each one of them, and quite early on, so figuring out, is this a fundamental error in that market? Were we did we go wrong on something, or is it something we can adjust because there was, I don't know, a small hiccup locally? So really adjusting it as early on as you can.
Fantastic. And I think that's been a really interesting journey from, I suppose, what would have been meetings, sat in the headquarters, planning and, thinking about what this could look like, right through how to execute that into, as you say, the early phase of successes and some of the challenges. Maybe then a good place to end would be through that experience. What would you say are your biggest learnings that you would share from that
Well,
into it?
yeah. Oh, sorry. I think there were lots of learnings for sure. I mean, we did this for 70, or I did it for 7 years. The company is still running. Um, but you need to expect curveballs. You need to expect something that you could not anticipate. One, of course, being time, that everything takes longer than you expect. You can do so many plans. Okay, now we have an approval. We have cars delivery on this date. We launch that date, or whatever you want to sort of put it up. There will always be things. We learned in Belgium, getting plates on a car is not the same as then you can actually activate the car. Then you need to go to another office and get another approval and stamp on some papers, and you're just shaking your head. But hey, that's reality there. So we have to abide by that. So there will be curveballs and things that you simply didn't expect. For us, we had some super fantastic years. It was really we had an industry that was growing rapidly, and then all of a sudden you're hit by outside elements. We of course we had the pandemic like everyone else, energy crisis, which didn't have a positive impact on charging a fleet of electric cars, I can tell you. Interest rates all of a sudden spiking. And when you finance a fleet of 1,600 cars, then that has a very imminent effect and a huge rising cost. And it was more or less the same time as energy prices rose as well. So okay, then you're faced with those challenges. Any industry can be hit by something like that, and you have to account for it and adjust, of course. I think we also there was also this positivity in mobility. When we started, everyone was expecting that we would be, by now we would have self-driving cars, and flying cars would be within a few years, and then, well, it's still going to be a few years before we see either of them in real deployment. So things are they're not necessarily moving slower, but they just take longer because there are obstacles that we can never account for, and something we have to adjust. When I sit today and sort of look back at what we did, we were absolutely entrepreneurial. We had to, I must say, almost reinvent the wheel. No one had done what we did before. You had rental cars, and it wasn't really the same. So, and when you're in it, you just push forward and you build it, and there's nothing there, so you find a way to solve it. Looking back, I think we were most likely a year or two early, especially in our internationalization. That had we waited, well, today I know we wouldn't have lost market, we wouldn't have lost sort of this land grabbing exercise, so we could have waited. But again, you don't know when you're in it.
Even with hindsight.
Yeah, in hindsight, everything is easier in hindsight, right? I think there's, regardless of industry, I mean, you have to be careful of how many markets you attack at the same time. It depends, of course, on the size of organization, back office support organization you have, of course, how much capital you have at hand. But each new market requires a lot of focus, also from management side, that things need to be nurtured, and sometimes forget how much time we actually spend on the first market. Okay, now it's running. The next one should be just like shouldn't be the time. We know everything, so how difficult it be. But it requires time and focus and from all stakeholders, essentially. And I think ultimately, sort of this approach, I've given some learnings from my time in mobility. I think it's not unique to mobility. The way of where I've approached it is similar to what you could have done in so many other industries. I used to work for a large chain of coffee shops, and we actually utilized a similar approach when analyzing new. Here it wasn't cities, but it was new locations for new coffee shops. Same sort of structure with a matrix and define elements that we had to analyze locally for that spot, and then having that feed into the business case, and then ultimately again deciding whether to go or not. So really having a structured approach to help you support the future success of the business.
Definitely. And no, I would agree. Although it's been really interesting to hear your experiences with GreenMobility, I think that's an absolutely correct point. That the processes and systems that enabled you to achieve that, from planning, understanding your own business through the matrix, and then the approaches and the local to international approach that you took. I think will be a really interesting listen for anybody who's facing this in any sector or with any product. So I just thank you very much. That was really, really interesting.
Thank you, Tom. My pleasure.